Hi everyone, Mychal Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and today we are continuing our series of Mastering Traditional Astrology. So for those of you who haven't already checked out our last video, which was an introduction to the planets, I definitely advise that you do so, because in that first video, we really lay down the ground rules of what it looks like from a traditional astrological perspective to make a beginning in astrology. There's an astrologer by the name of Margaret C. Hone who wrote in her book, The Textbook of Modern Astrology, that it really doesn't matter which of several first things is learned first. And at Oraculos, we tend to feel the same way. However, from a traditional astrology perspective, the planets really constitute one of the biggest and most important parts of traditional astrology to really invest a lot of your initial energy in learning astrology into, because the planets are really the backdrop and the background of so much of what we do interpretationally in astrology. So today we're going to be diving into yet another topic on the 7 classical planets, including Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. We're going to bring in Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto because people love to talk about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So might as well we talk about how we view them and use them here at Oraculos within this larger traditional philosophy of the 7 classical planets. And we're also going to be diving into what makes planets good and what makes planets not good from a traditional astrological perspective. So I definitely hope that you stick with us for the entire program today because it is going to be amazing. And as always, if you haven't already subscribed to the Oraculos podcast, both here on YouTube as well as wherever else you find us on the internet, please do yourself a favor and subscribe to the podcast because we are coming out rather frequently these days with amazing content about the foundations of classical astrology. And I really do hope that you tune in because it's good stuff that we have over here at Oraculos. Also, speaking of the foundations of classical astrology, this coming fall 2022, we have our Foundations of Classical Astrology program starting up, which is the first semester of our 2-year Excellence in Astrology program. So if you've always wanted to either start a professional astrological practice and you haven't known how, or if you have had a professional astrology practice for forever, but you've been wanting to root yourself in a more structured learning environment so that you can practice a more structured approach to astrology, then by all means check out our Foundations of Classical Astrology program, which begins this coming fall 2022. And you can find out more information about FOCA, the Foundations of Classical Astrology, and all of our other astrological offerings over on our website at www.oraculosastrology.com/programs. Now, without further ado, let us dive into our presentation for the day. So here on the screen, we have once again what is known as our Chaldean Order, and we went into a deep dive about what the Chaldean Order is on our last episode of our Mastering Traditional Astrology series. So if you haven't checked that out already, please do pause here, go and watch that first, and then wheel and come again and check this video out afterwards. So here we have our Chaldean Order, which, as we know, are the 7 visible planets from our Earth-based perspective. And we know that we're including the sun and the moon into that because the classical definition of planet is a wandering star. And insofar as both the sun and the moon do seem to also wander across the sky, as do the other planets in the sky, from our fixed geocentric or Earth-based perspective, we also consider the sun and the moon to be planets in a more general sense, even though we know that the moon is the satellite of the Earth and the sun is actually our star. So the sun and the moon are luminaries and not planets, but for convenience's sake, we consider them to be just as much planets as every other planet that we have here on the screen. So the Chaldean Order is Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the moon. And in our last episode, we ended by talking about how the various planets receive their natures based on their proximity to the sun as the source of heat and fire within the universe, and the moon and the earth as the sources of moisture or water within the universe. And we said that Saturn is thought to be cold and dry because Saturn is furthest from the heat of the sun and the moisture of the moon and the earth. Jupiter is considered to be hot and moist because Jupiter is beneath the double burner of the sun and the Mars, and that doubling of heat passing through Jupiter causes some of the ice of Saturn to melt and precipitate and move downward onto the body of Jupiter. So therefore, Jupiter is hot and moist. We said that Mars is intemperately hot and dry, one, because of his proximity to the sun, and two, also because the color of Mars as being this bright red planet, who the ancients considered to be red like bloodshed and red like war and red like the heart of fire, Mars was considered not just to be hot and dry, but intemperately hot and dry, having this doubling of heat within his nature, both from his proximity to the sun as well as because of his color. The sun, who we know is the source of heat and dryness within the cosmos, but who the ancients considered was able to hold that heat within himself in a more equable way because the sun stood in the center of the harmony of the spheres. So here we see 3 planets above the sun, and we see 3 planets below the sun, of course, barring our Earth, which from a geocentric perspective isn't a part of this organization of planets. But the sun essentially stands as the still point or the heart within the cosmos from which the other planets not only derive their power, also the sun is standing as the planet who the other planets are going in their revolutions around, since he is in the middle of both the superior planets above him and the inferior planets of Venus and Mercury and the moon, which we know is our Earth's satellite. Then from the sun, we went down into Venus, who we know has the nature of heat and moisture. Heat because of her proximity to the sun, moisture because of her proximity to the moon and the earth. The moon, who primarily has moisture as her foundational elemental constitution, but who also participates somewhat in the generation of heat because of the relationship that the moon and the sun have with each other. And finally, Mercury, who is the greatest mystery of our traditional Western astrology, who has the ability to be both wet and dry, separately and fully. Which means that when Mercury is wet, Mercury is fully wet. When Mercury is dry, Mercury is fully dry. So of these 7 classical planets, we see that Mercury is the only planet that has the ability to do this infinitely impossible act of holding these contradictions within himself without being destroyed by those contradictions. So whereas these other planets can be comfortably classified based on the 4 classical temperaments, Mercury can't. Now, we haven't really gone into the 4 classical temperaments within our last video, and it's something that I do hope to go deeply into with you in at least one of our next few videos. But for the ancients, they considered there to be 4 temperaments. And those temperaments really align with our concept of the 4 elements to a large degree. So the 4 temperaments were choleric, and choleric aligns with the element of fire, in that choleric is considered to be hot and dry, or in this case, we have warm and dry. Secondly, there was the temperament of melancholic, and melancholic corresponds with the earth element, insofar as both the earth and this melancholic temperament were considered to be cold and dry. Then from there, we have the sanguine temperament. And the sanguine temperament, which was thought to be best of them all, was hot and moist. And the sanguine temperament corresponds with the air element for us, insofar as we also classically consider the air element to be hot and moist. And then finally, there was the phlegmatic temperament. And the phlegmatic temperament corresponds with water insofar as the phlegmatic temperament is considered to be cold and moist, or cold and wet. So those are our 4 temperaments from a classical astrology perspective. Choleric, which is hot and dry like fire. Melancholic, which is cold and dry like earth. Sanguine, which is hot and moist like the air. And finally, phlegmatic, which is cold and moist like the water. And these 4 temperaments were thought to also constitute the internal nature of the planet, since we know that the planets also have these double qualities within themselves. Therefore, Saturn was thought to be melancholic as a result of being cold and dry. Jupiter was thought to be sanguine as a result of being hot and wet. Mars was thought to be choleric as a result of being intemperately hot and dry. The Sun was also thought to be choleric as a result of being hot and dry. Venus was thought to be sanguine as a result of being hot and moist. The Moon was also thought to be sanguine as a result of her also, from Ptolemy's perspective, being hot and moist. And then finally, Mercury was thought to have no temperament at all, because Mercury is the only one of the classical planetary deities who does not have one of these dual qualities, natures within himself that allows him to be a particular temperament. Now, I think that this is another great mystery that's embedded within our classical Western vision of astrology, because not only does Mercury not have a stabilized nature that we can put a label on, but Mercury also doesn't have a temperament that we can really cast him in. And as a result of that, we find Mercury really being able to do the mercurial task of shape-shifting and being reflective of that which he is in connection with. So while the other planets do have a definite temperament of their own, Mercury is the one planet that does not. Now, this topic of the temperaments, which, like I said, we'll go into in far more detail later on in this series of Mastering Traditional Astrology. So by all means, please do stay tuned, because there's so much to unpack in terms of this topic of the temperaments and the 4 qualities in general, and the 4 elements and everything really. But this topic of the qualities and how those qualities become temperaments takes us directly into our next discussion of what makes a planet good and what makes a planet bad. Now, from Ptolemy's perspective, and within Ptolemy's cosmology, what made a planet good was the sort of nature that coalesced within that planet. For example, Saturn was thought to have a nature that had no ability to actually support human life. And as a result of that, Saturn was thought to be an evil planet. Jupiter, on the other hand, being a hot and moist planet, was thought to have a nature that was in support of human life, because the heat and the moisture that we find in Jupiter is also the heat and the moisture that we find within our own bodies. It's the heat and the moisture that we find within our own Earth. And therefore, Jupiter, as a hot and moist planet, was thought to be a supporter of life, whereas Saturn wasn't. But we find this description of the planets as either being supportive of life or destructive of life, following down through the entire order of the 7 classical planets. Now, in Ptolemy's book, the Tetrabiblos, which is this, and this is the Ashmand translation of the Tetrabiblos. So if you haven't gotten yourself a copy of it yet, please do. It's a rather tiny book, and it's readable for the most part. So in Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, he speaks about this notion of the planets as being benefic or malefic right after he describes the internal dual constitution of the 7 classical planets. So in the same way as we're organizing this lecture series is the same way how Ptolemy organized this book. So in chapter 5 of the Tetrabiblos, and this is page 14, chapter 5, for those of you who have the book, the title is Benefics and Malefics. And he says, of the 4 temperaments or qualities above mentioned, 2 are nutritive and prolific. And for those of you who don't know, prolific means something that has the ability to be abundant or something that has the ability to unfold as something beneficial or promising on a large scale. So he's saying that 2 of the qualities are nutritive and prolific. And those 2 qualities are heat and moisture. He goes on to say, by these, all matter coalesces and is nourished. Therefore, saying that by these, all matter takes on a distinct form of its own, and all matter has the ability to have an independent life as a result of these 2 qualities of heat and moisture. Therefore, we see that heat and moisture are fundamentally life-supporting within themselves. He goes on to say that the other 2 are noxious and destructive. In other words, dryness and cold. By these, all matter is decayed and dissipated. And therefore, for Ptolemy, things that abound in dryness or things that abound in cold are thought to be things that don't necessarily have the ability to support life, because by these 2 qualities, all things are decayed and dissipated. And just to remind us of the 2 planets that are abounding in these 2 qualities, we're going to go back onto page 13 and read where he says that Saturn produces cold and dryness, for he is most remote both from the sun's heat and from the earth's vapors. But he is more effective in the production of cold than dryness. Therefore, Saturn is intemperately cold and dry, but he creates more cold than dryness. Then he goes on to say that Mars chiefly causes dryness and is also strongly heating by means of his own fiery nature. And we spoke about that earlier, that the color of Mars causes Mars to have a fiery nature, which is indicated by his color, he says, and in consequence of his vicinity to the sun, the sphere of which is immediately below him. So therefore, Ptolemy is saying that Saturn produces excessive coldness, and Mars is also intemperate like Saturn, but Mars, on the other hand, produces excessive dryness, which takes us back here where he says that the other 2 qualities are noxious and destructive, in other words, dryness and cold, because by these all matter is decayed and dissipated. So if we first know the internal nature of the planets, then we also know, if we follow this rubric that Ptolemy is outlining, whether or not those planets are going to be good and life-supporting or evil and not life-supporting. Now he goes on and says, therefore, 2 of the planets, on account of their temperate quality, and because heat and moisture are predominant in them, are considered by the ancients as benefics, or causers of good. These are Jupiter and Venus, and the moon is also considered for that same reason. So once again, remember that earlier we had said that for Ptolemy, the moon was not considered to be cold and wet, which is something that we see happening later on in medieval astrology, where they said, well, hey, something in the universe has to be cold and wet, let's make it the moon. But for Ptolemy, the moon was not cold and wet, because if he were to make the moon cold and wet, then the moon would not fit into the sequence of benefics that he was trying to build in his philosophy. He goes on to say that, but Saturn and Mars are esteemed of a contrary nature and malefic, or causers of evil. The first, Saturn, from his excess of cold, and the other, Mars, from his excess of dryness. And so we have within this model benefic planets in the forms of Jupiter, Venus, and the moon because they have this temperate quality of heat and moisture within them. And we also have malefic planets or causers of evil in the form of Saturn and Mars, because those two planets are intemperate within their natures. And insofar as we consider the universe needing to have a sense of equilibrium and balance and equipoise, to have anything within the universe that is intemperate would be to have things that throw off the life-supporting balance. And Saturn and Mars fulfill that role from a universal perspective, and therefore Saturn and Mars are considered to be destroyers of life, whereas Jupiter, Venus, and the moon, because of their heat and moisture, which is once again similar to our own human body, similar to the earth underneath our feet. Heat and moisture is also similar to the food that we eat. It's also similar to our mother's womb. So when we think about heat and moisture, we think about that being the exact temperate sort of environment that allows nature, but also humanity to flourish in its highest capacity. Therefore, we find these qualities most abundant and specifically abundant within Jupiter, Venus, and the moon. He ends by saying, the Sun and Mercury are deemed of common influence and productive either of good or evil in unison with whatever planets they may be connected with. Now, this is something interesting because we usually find this notion of a planet being evil based on its connection with another planet being something that is a function of Mercury. But here Ptolemy is saying that it's a function of both the Sun and Mercury to be common or to be able to go in either direction depending on the planets that they are joined to. But in general, when it comes to the Sun, in traditional astrology, our general consensus tends to be that the Sun is evil by conjunction, but benefic by aspect. So we love a trine to the Sun. We don't necessarily love a conjunction to the Sun, because to be conjunct the Sun means to be burnt up by the Sun. It means to be completely destroyed by the heat and the fire that's held within the Sun. And in traditional astrology, the term for this is combustion. And there's no worse evil that can happen to a planet other than that planet being combust. Abraham ibn Ezra, in his book On Continuous Horoscopy and the Judgment of Nativities, he tells us that there are 3 conditions that planets can have that are worst beyond all measure. And he says that those 3 conditions are if a planet is combust, i.e., if a planet is in conjunction or approaching to the conjunction or is just separating from the conjunction with the Sun, if a planet is combust, if a planet is retrograde as well, and also if a planet is cadent, and particularly if that planet is cadent within either the 6th house or the 12th house, which is a topic that we'll speak about when we get to the houses. But the point of the matter is that as far as planetary conditions are concerned, combustion, or to be one with the Sun, either approaching conjunction to the Sun, separating from conjunction to the Sun, or in that moment being conjunct the Sun, there's no worst evil that can happen to a planet other than combustion. Now, I know that some of you who are aware of solar conditions will say, but what about cazimi? Cazimi is when a planet is within 17 minutes of the Sun. So when we talk about planets being cazimi, we're talking about the planet finding a point of stillness in the heart of the Sun, around which there is nothing but a roaring, destructive fire. And if that planet can find itself in that still point with the Sun, then that still point with the Sun becomes a fountainhead of blessedness. But the moment that planet steps out of the heart of the Sun and returns back into the fire of that Sun, that planet then becomes combust once more, and that combustion of the planet is one of the most destructive things that can happen to a planet. So once again, cazimi is when a planet is within 17 minutes of an exact conjunction with the sun, and beyond that 17 minutes of that exact conjunction with the sun, that planet is thought to be combust. Now, Mercury, on the other hand, like we said in the last video, is the planet that has the ability to really be good with the good and bad with the bad and masculine with the masculine and feminine with the feminine, and a daytime planet with daytime planets and a nighttime planet with nighttime planets. Mercury really has this ability because that is something that we find part and parcel of the nature of Mercury. Now, the final thing I want to talk to you about in terms of this notion of benefic planets and malefic planets is that while they're called benefic and malefic, there are also categories within that. So Saturn, for example, is considered to be the greater malefic, whereas Mars is considered to be the lesser malefic. Saturn we can view as the greater malefic because not only is the physical body of Saturn that much larger than the physical body of Mars, but also the orbital path of Saturn is that much larger than the orbital path of Mars. What Mars accomplishes in 2 years, Saturn accomplishes in 30 years. So therefore, we consider Saturn to be the greater malefic, whereas we consider Mars to be the lesser malefic. Similarly, Jupiter we consider to be the greater benefic, or the greater doer of good, whereas Venus we consider to be the lesser benefic. And once again, the same logic applies that the physical body of Jupiter is that much larger than the physical body of Venus, but also the orbital path of Jupiter is that much larger than the orbital path of Venus. What Venus accomplishes in 225 days, Jupiter is accomplishing in 12 years. In terms of Jupiter making a full orbit through the 12 signs of the zodiac, Jupiter does that in 12 years, whereas Venus is accomplishing that same journey through the 12 signs of the zodiac in roughly 225 days. So therefore, we have Jupiter as the greater benefic, and we have Venus as the lesser benefic. Now, the next thing we want to say is, well, hey, if we consider the moon also to be a benefic planet, why doesn't the moon have one of these titles? And who knows? Truthfully, that is really the answer, that the moon doesn't really fit within this notion of the greater and the lesser benefic or malefic in the same way that Jupiter and Venus and Saturn and Mars fit within that comfortably. So probably it's because of this why later astrologers coming after Ptolemy, still referencing Ptolemy in their writing, but augmenting Ptolemy's notion of the qualities of the moon, probably that's why they thought that the moon needed another quality that did not make the moon hot and wet like the other benefic planets, because we don't really have some place for the moon to fit within this notion of greater and lesser benefic, in the same way that we have a place for Jupiter and Venus to fit. But I think that even beyond this, the moon holds that position as an honorary benefic in a sense, because the moon is our mother. In Abraham ibn Ezra, he says that the reason why we have to check the moon in all things, whether we're referring to horary charts or electional charts or natal charts or any charts at all, the reason why we check the moon is because the moon is the cosmic root of all things. And it's through the moon and through the sphere of the moon that us down below on Earth receive the influences of all of the other planets above us. So the moon serves as this benefic astrological atmosphere that surrounds our planet. And it's through the moon that the nutrients and that all of the positive life force that we receive from all of the other planets comes filtered down to us on Earth in a way that we can digest that in our earthly experience. Because if it weren't for the moon, following the same notion of Ibn Ezra, if it weren't for the moon, then we would have no filter between our planet and these titanic forces of the other planets above us. And without that filter of the moon as our mother, then possibly the energies or possibly those stellar influences of the other planets above us would be far too much for us to actually handle and readily assimilate within ourselves as human beings on this earth. So the moon specifically does get this title of being a benefic, and I believe that she doesn't necessarily need to fit within this notion of greater benefic or lesser benefic, because in the way that she serves as the filter for us on earth of all of the other stellar rays of heaven, I think that that is enough to say that she does stand as a benefic for us in general, even if she doesn't fit within this larger notion of what a benefic or a malefic planet may be. That is the end of our talk today on the benefic planets and the malefic planets. And I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope that you learned something new. And if this is your first time hearing any of these topics, please share with us down below in the comment section what you enjoyed most about this video. And as always, please do like these videos as well as tune into them and subscribe to the Oraculos podcast if you haven't done so already. And another plug is that if you want to dive deeper into these topics with us, we have our upcoming Foundations of Classical Astrology program coming up in the fall of 2022, where we go into these topics and so much more in terms of how these things directly tie into us becoming better students as well as practitioners of classical astrology. So if you've always wanted to not just dive deeper into the esoteric heart of astrology, but to see how that spiritual content of astrology also feeds into our physical, tangible practice of practicing great astrology, then please do sign up for our upcoming FOCA program this fall 2022. So until next time, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you very soon. Have a good one. Bye-bye.